The house was eerily quiet that night, a strange calm that hung in the air. He had been living in a state of constant dread, trapped in a toxic marriage to Laura, a woman whose cruelty seemed to know no bounds. She had broken him down over the years, wearing him down with her emotional and physical abuse. He had tried to leave many times, but each attempt had been met with more violence, more threats. It seemed as if there was no escape, no way out of the hell he had been living in. Shelby had always been a quiet man, the kind of person who kept to himself and avoided conflict. But over the years, the abuse had chipped away at his soul. He had become numb to the pain, to the insults, to the endless verbal and physical attacks. His life had become a series of survival tactics, each day a battle just to make it through. But something inside him had changed. He no longer feared his wife. He no longer feared the consequences of his actions. He had reached a breaking point, and he knew that there was no turning back. It had started as a normal evening, with Shelby and his brother-in-law, Nicholas Ivanchich, sitting together in the living room. They had smoked some weed, the effects of the marijuana making them both feel relaxed, a temporary escape from the reality of their lives. They had watched The Grinch, a silly holiday movie that seemed out of place given the circumstances. Nick had fallen asleep on the couch, a peaceful look on his face as he snored lightly. Shelby had glanced over at him, his mind spinning with thoughts of what he was about to do. The clock on the wall ticked slowly, the seconds dragging on as he tried to calm his nerves. But there was no calming them. The anger, the rage, the sense of helplessness had been building for years, and tonight it would finally boil over. Shelby had always been a man of action when it came to protecting his family, but he had never imagined that he would be the one to bring harm to those he loved. But the more he thought about it, the more it made sense. Laura, his wife, had destroyed him. She had torn him apart, piece by piece, until he no longer recognized the man he had once been. He had to stop her. He had to stop the cycle of abuse that had consumed their lives. The hammer was in his hand, cold and heavy, a tool of destruction. He stood over Nick, who remained blissfully unaware of the danger lurking just inches from his face. Shelby's hand shook as he raised the hammer, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what had come over him, but there was no turning back now. He brought the hammer down with all his strength, the blow landing with a sickening thud against Nick's temple. The impact was brutal, and Nick's body jerked violently in response. Shelby didn't stop. He struck again and again, until Nick's body was still, his life extinguished in a matter of moments. The blood that spurted from Nick's head was something Shelby would never forget. It splattered across the room, staining the carpet, the walls, the furniture. It was a mess, a chaos of red that felt surreal to Shelby, like something out of a nightmare. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to move quickly. He dragged Nick's body into the bedroom, covering his head with a blanket to hide the extent of the damage. It was a futile attempt, a vain hope that somehow he could erase what he had done. But deep down, he knew that the horror of that moment would never leave him. It was too late for regrets. Shelby's mind raced as he stood over Nick's lifeless body. He had just killed his brother-in-law, someone who had been a friend to him, someone he had known for years. But there was no time to mourn. Laura and her family were next. He had a mission to complete. He had to finish what he had started. The thought of killing his wife, the woman who had caused him so much pain, felt almost surreal. But in that moment, it felt necessary. He had to free himself from her grip, from the constant torment she had subjected him to. There was no other way. As Shelby moved through the house, he felt detached from the reality of what he was doing. His actions seemed almost mechanical, as if he were operating on autopilot. He grabbed the hammer again, the cold steel feeling strangely familiar in his hand. He moved toward the bedroom where Laura was sleeping, unaware of the horror that was about to unfold. He had no intention of waking her, of giving her a chance to fight back. He was done with her, done with the years of suffering she had put him through. The hammer came down again and again until Laura was no longer breathing. Shelby didn't stop until he was sure she was gone. He didn't want her to suffer, but he didn't want to take any chances. He moved quickly, dragging her body into the living room where Nick's had already been hidden. The blood had soaked through the carpet, the stench of death filling the air. But there was no time to clean up. There was no time to think. Shelby had to keep moving. The hammer came down again and again until Laura was no longer breathing. Shelby didn't stop until he was sure she was gone. He didn't want her to suffer, but he didn't want to take any chances. He moved quickly, dragging her body into the living room where Nix had already been hidden. The blood had soaked through the carpet, the stench of death filling the air. But there was no time to clean up. There was no time to think. Shelby had to keep moving. The rest of the family followed in the same manner. He killed them all one by one, using the hammer to end their lives. There was no mercy, no hesitation. He had become a machine, his mind focused solely on the task at hand. Each blow was a release, a way to rid himself of the demons that had haunted him for so long. It wasn't about revenge. It was about survival. Shelby had convinced himself that this was the only way out. When the killing was done, Shelby stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the bodies of his wife, her family, and Nick. The silence was deafening, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He didn't feel remorse, not yet. There was too much adrenaline coursing through his veins, too much fear of being caught. He had to cover his tracks. He had to make sure that no one would ever find out what he had done. He went to Home Depot and bought tarps, rope, and other supplies to help him move the bodies. He couldn't risk leaving any evidence behind. The trench in the backyard was the only place he could think of to bury them. But even that seemed like a desperate move. Shelby worked in the dead of night, digging the hole little by little, trying to avoid attracting attention. The bodies had to be hidden, and the sooner he could bury them, the better. But as the days passed, Shelby's paranoia grew. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him, that the police would show up at his door any minute. He had to act quickly, but he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. He moved the bodies into the trench one by one and covered them with dirt. The smell of death lingered in the air, but he did his best to mask it. He burned incense, used air fresheners, anything to cover the stench. But it wasn't enough. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. The police were eventually called to investigate the scene. Shelby had been careful, but there were too many clues, too many inconsistencies in his story. The bodies were discovered, and the investigation began. Shelby's confession, when it came, was chilling in its calmness. He spoke of his actions without remorse, without emotion. It was as if he had no understanding of the gravity of what he had done. The police were shocked by his lack of empathy, his cold detachment. As the trial unfolded, Shelby's defense team tried to argue that he had been a victim of abuse, that he had been pushed to the edge by years of mistreatment. But the prosecution painted a different picture. They argued that Shelby had been a man driven by rage, a man who had killed without hesitation. The jury was left to decide whether he deserved the death penalty or life in prison. In the end, Shelby was sentenced to life in prison. He would never see the outside world again, never be free to live the life he had once dreamed of. His children, left without both parents, were taken into the custody of Shelby's mother. But the damage had been done. The children would never fully recover from the trauma they had witnessed. They would grow up with the scars of that night, haunted by the memories of the violence that had destroyed their family. Shelby's story is a tragic one, a reminder of the dangers of abuse, of the darkness that can consume a person when they are pushed too far. It raises questions about the nature of violence, about the lengths a person will go to in order to escape their circumstances. But in the end, it is a story of loss, of lives destroyed by one man's choices. And it is a reminder that sometimes the consequences of those choices are more devastating than we can ever imagine.